Two Wood for a Wheat is a board game podcast. We review and criticize board games, diving deep into the strategies and mechanisms that make them great or make them forgettable.
Welcome to Two Wood for a Wheat.
My name is Patrick Flannery.
And I'm Tony Faber.
On today's episode, we will be reviewing Ian Brody's War of the Ring, the card game. A game about thematic tensions between the shadow forces and the free peoples of Middle-earth, doing battle and casting characters into dangerous paths and fighting for the heart and soul and future of Middle-earth. Then we will be discussing IP-based games, how they best integrate mechanisms, how the tension between their theming and those mechanisms can rear their ugly heads.
How you doing, Pat?
Tony, I'm doing fine. Saturday morning, the sun is out. It's about 100 degrees outside, and I'm trying not to melt, but I had probably 3 pints of ice cream over the various days this week, and I think I've drunk about a bathtub full of water, and I am raring to go to talk about a crazy team game, War of the Ring of the card game. Very excited. How about you?
I am also broiling. It's tough when you have dogs because you can't really walk them. It's gotten to the point where I can't even walk them early in the morning. It's still too hot for them.
Yes.
So they're kind of antsy. It's a good time to have a pool.
Yes, I'm regretting not buying a house in the suburbs with a big pool. Well, not really. I have a lake, and that would be a waste of land.
Trust me, a pool generally is too much work, too much expense. I'm not really excited about having a pool. But
we had a pool in Michigan. We had a beach house in Michigan when I was growing up, and we forgot to take care of it for a while, or I should say my parents did. And my mom returned to the Michigan house to discover that the pool was full of about 10,000 tadpoles that had bred in it. And she didn't really know what to do with it, so she said, "Hey, Pat, do you want a tadpole?" "Yes, Mom, I'd love a pet frog. Great." And so she saved one of the 10,000, and then she poured about 10 gallons of chlorine into the pool and liquefied the rest.
Oof.
And then we swam in it a couple of days later. Very disgusting. I don't recommend.
That's sort of horrible.
It is. That little tadpole, sadly, did not grow up to be a full frog. I did flush him down the toilet and play a ceremonial version of taps on the trumpet for him and sung him out rightly.
I don't know where to go after.
Let's go to board games. Have you been playing anything this week?
Clean your pool. That's the lesson here.
I think
Keep
so.
your pool clean.
Or give it completely to nature. One of the two.
And not much in the way of board games other than War of the Ring, the card game, which I've been scrambling to get various games together, getting friends from far distances, overcoming illnesses among the players, and I've managed to get this played at both the 2 and 4 player counts. So I'm excited for our feature review. But what else have you been playing, Pat?
Did some of you have to trek through the mines of Moria, whilst others rode in on Guahir in order to meet these games, and you used your wizard staff to cure one of the kingly folk of their sickness in order to get them into their full power to play this game properly, Tony?
No, but one of our players did get lost in the Old Forest for a while. Got to spend some time with Tom Bombadil.
Well, that seems fine.
Yeah, that's what I'd like to do. If the world is ending, I'd like to spend the last of it with Tom Bombadil.
I would too. Well, Tony, I didn't really play anything either aside from War of the Ring, the card game. So if it's okay with you, let's jump right into it.
The War of the Ring, the card game, is a 2 or 4, primarily 4, according to the authors, player board game / card game from Ares Games and Ian Brody that came out actually at the end of last year officially, although I think we saw it in wide release mostly here in 2023. And in War of the Ring, the card game, what we are doing is we're playing either the Fellowship or Dark Power players. This is a tableau building card game. Tableau building combined with fighting over battlegrounds.
Combined with deck deconstruction?
Sure. It takes place in the full game over 9 rounds, and in each round, a battleground and a path comes out which the players fight over. Now, a battleground is what it seems like, a battleground where armies fight, and a path is like a character battleground where characters fight over the battleground. And each player plays characters, items, and other events perhaps to the battleground in an attempt to have the most strength at the battleground and win the battleground by having the most strength and getting the victory points. that path or battleground is worth. That's, at its essence, the core of the game. And you play out these cards by discarding one card to play another. So the cost of every card is always discarding one card. And you can play it straight out to the battleground, or you can play it into reserve. And if you play a card into reserve, it can't go to a battleground that round, but you can save it for a future battleground where it may be more relevant or where it may have more power. And you may also use its reserve ability, if it has one, immediately. Because you can't simply play any card to a battleground. The cards you can play to battlegrounds or paths, which again are the character battlegrounds, are limited by symbols on the cards in the case of battlegrounds, and numbers indicating which of the 9 paths they're allowed to appear at during the game. And of course, this is story-based, so you can't have armies showing up in Bag End at the beginning of the story. Not that you can bring armies onto a character path anyway, but it's got to be character or story appropriate for those things to appear. Events also can be played in which are one-shot cards and then they're eliminated, which affect the game in various ways. And there's some differences between the two sides, besides thematically. For one, at the beginning of each round, the Dark Power player draws 4 cards, or each of the Dark Power players in the 4-player game draws 4 cards, and each of the Fellowship players draws just 3 cards, exemplifying the vast resources that the Dark Powers has at their disposal. The advantage that the Fellowship players have is that they are the defender in the majority of contests. Half the battlegrounds, one side is the attacker and the other side is the defender, but on the character paths, the Fellowship is always the defender. And being the defender is good because it means you always win ties at that battleground, and there may be some built-in inherent defensive strength at the battleground or character path depending on what it is, which also gives an inherent advantage to the defender. The battlegrounds are chosen randomly at the start of the game, and they come up in a random order, and all of them may not appear in the game, whereas the paths, there's 3 paths for each of the 9 rounds, and one of them is chosen each round, and generally the other 2 don't appear, with some exceptions. So you go through the game, putting out cards to battlegrounds, putting out cards to your reserve. When you attack in battles, or on the path in the case of the Dark Power players, all those cards are permanently eliminated. If you defend in battles and you actually don't need that card on defense or on the path, the card can be cycled, which means discarded, coming back into your hand when you run out of cards and have to reshuffle your deck. But there's a difference there in that some cards will come back and some cards will never come back. Cards have various powers which are way too numerous to mention in this brief overview. Some are items that attach to other characters. Some, have more strength in a given part of the story, a given path or battleground. Some do different things like allow you to draw extra cards, or even do things like bring previously fought battlegrounds out of somebody's victory point pile to be fought again in that round, and all kinds of different things. Anyway, you play through 9 rounds, and whoever has the most victory points at the end of the game wins. If one player ever gets up at the end of a round by 10 or more victory points, one side, I should say, they automatically win at that point. There's a lot of little details of the game I could mention, but I hope that gives a general sense. Anything that in a general sense needs to be known, Pat?
Yeah, 2 essential things I think we should mention in order for folks to understand this game. Each side, whether it's the Free Peoples or the Shadow player, has 60 cards, but those 60 cards are split between 2 decks of 30. One deck for the Free Peoples will be the Dunedain, made up of Aragorn and the Dunedain folks, as well as the elves. And the other deck will be made up of the wizard characters and the hobbits and the dwarves and the Rohirrim, while the shadow forces, 30 cards with one player, will be made up of all the Mordor forces and the 9 Nazgul, while the other set will be made up of the various monsters such as Balrogs and the White Hands of Isengard.
The Saruman forces.
Correct, yeah. With the Saruman forces, as well as the Southron people who come, the Corsairs of Umbar, who come up from the Southron lands, and they apply and affect individually to thematically various battlefields and various paths. Right, so
yeah, you could say that in a 4-player game you have a Aragorn player and a Gandalf player on the Fellowship side, and a Sauron player and a Saruman player on the Dark Power side, you could say.
And to understand something about this game is to understand that so many elements of this game are randomness. The cards in your hand are random, drawn from a set of 30 or fewer. The story paths are random, drawn 1 of 3. The battlefields are random, although it will be Free Peoples, then Shadow, then Free Peoples, then Shadow. You're picking from about 1 of 9 of various battlefields each time. And this should be a problem, but it is not. As far as I see it, deciding on how to make the most of your cards and how you use them and when you use them, that is the game. And the second thing to understand is that the game allows for this ample space around this randomness by giving you so many things to do with the cards, including holding them over for later use like a battery. You can play a card into a battlefield, play a card into a story path. You can use it as currency to play another card, a la Race for the Galaxy. Well, this card isn't good for me right now. I will discard it to play this very good card for me. You can play this card into your reserve, holding it over for future use and maybe granting you a special ability in the meantime. You can forsake a few of these cards, effectively eliminating from the game in order to draw other cards that may be more useful in the moment. A card may not be able to use for all of these things, but it can be used for at least a few, leading to an inherent tension on each of these cards that allows you to assess its use value against these given sets of randomness.
Another point I'd like to make about how the game feels, if you played a game like Reiner Knizia's Battleline, right, or Schotten Totten, it's something akin to that where you're fighting at a couple different battlegrounds, and sort of a core principle of those kind of games is you never want to win an area by more than you have to. Because let's say a battleground is worth 2 points. If you throw 5 cards to give yourself 7 strength at that battleground, the opponent has nothing, you're still just winning 2 points, but now you're taking away all those cards out of potential power for future rounds. Ideally, you barely win everything with the minimum possible resource expenditure so you can have more resources go to other battlegrounds in the future. And that creates an inherent tenseness, an inherent closeness in the battles because you never want to overcommit unless you think somebody is going to pour in a ton of strength there. But you kind of want to hold back and see what they're going to do, which leads me to talking about what I think is one of the strengths of the game, which is the tempo considerations in each round. You're trying to take non-committal moves early in the round to get the opponent to lure out their strength to see what they're going to do so you can efficiently allocate your resources to fight for those spots or not if you don't think you can win. And if you don't think you can win any of the battlegrounds, we'll get a ton of cards in reserve so you're in great position going forward, right? Or maybe you get something out early to make the opponent respond and commit, perhaps because that's the great spot for that card, so you're gonna get it out there, or maybe you're holding it back to try to pass them at the last minute. There's a lot of push and pull and tenseness and trying to barely win that fits with those tempo considerations as you push your luck as to how little you can commit and still win. Some really interesting stuff there.
Yes. I want to unpack 2 things there that you mentioned having to do with timing. Do not underestimate the card cycle and the threat of reusing your best cards. Each deck is only made up of 30 cards, and in the trilogy scenario, the longer form scenario, you will see the deck cycled multiple times. In fact, you'll only hang on to maybe a quarter of the deck by the end of the game for having reused it so many times and eliminated these cards. And it means that there's an immense trade-off between using cards singly for one battle where they're eliminated either on the offensive or by staggering defense to a huge offense, or you have that option where they're eliminated, or redrawing and reusing them for multiple battles that they survive. But the game is only a maximum of 9 rounds, and it is possible that your best cards will be randomly forsaken and eliminated from the game, so you can't hold on to your darling cards too tightly. There's this constant value input of, is this the right time to utilize this during this stage in the game, whilst also considering, how do I utilize this during this round so that I can best affect it and change the state of the game whilst not revealing my hand? In that sense, it has a very similar game feel to Twilight Struggle, a game about knowing the deck, knowing that it's only a matter of time before certain cards are played, knowing the horrible things that your enemy can do to you, and knowing the amazing things that you can do to your enemy, and figuring out how best to duck and dodge the vulnerable setups for bad outcomes while maximizing the good outcomes. And part of that, I'd say, is the element of delaying, because each battle and each round is a given setup of a battle and a path, each with an inherent defense value. And this is mitigated by the players playing out various cards. Now, there is the ability in this game to pass. You have to have fewer cards than your two opponents, or you have to have as many cards as your carryover limit, which is effectively the number of cards that it can carry into the next round, but it also allows you to pass. So it's this larger estimation on timing where you can increase your carryover limit and pass earlier than the other players and then jump back into combat at will.
Yeah, as long as not everyone has passed consecutively, you can jump back in after passing, which is, I think, a very good design decision and very interesting, and it allowed some tempo considerations. And sometimes people may pass really early if everybody's satisfied with the outcome, how everything has turned out. I also want to say that tension between recycling your deck and having cards get eliminated is very different in my experience for the two players.
Yes.
Because the dark power player is attacking most of the time, in my experience, their cards got eliminated more often than the Fellowship cards, like permanently removed from the game. Mm-hmm. And they ended up with a much smaller deck than the Fellowship did. Because the Fellowship is defending 3/4 of the time, and if they defend and don't need those defenders necessarily to make the difference, they get those cards back. Also, they can defend the paths. A lot of what defends the paths, the character paths, are Hobbits, and the Hobbits all tend to have an ability, like if they're eliminated defending the character path, they actually get recycled back into your deck instead of being eliminated. So in playing the dark power player, I found that, like, I was running out of cards at the end of the game. Playing the Fellowship player, I found I almost had too many cards at the end of the game.
Well, double down on that, the fact that as a shadow player, you have this constant flirtation with overcommitting. Because inside of the path combat, the Fellowship player, they have an inherent value per card. But the shadow forces, if they can have a differential between the defense of the free peoples and how much attack value the shadow forces have, they will get victory points, i.e. corruption, for that differential. So if they have committed 6 attack against 1 inherent defense, yeah, they'll probably lose all 6 of those cards, but they will come away with 5 victory points, which is a huge number inside of that single path combat. Of course, this may screw them later on, considering they just flushed out, perhaps an eighth of their deck, but it may be worth it to them to get those 5 points.
Yeah, that's a great point. Tempts you to overcommit, and then that can lead into those decisions about how many cards are going to get eliminated. And now, I'm pivoting to something I don't like about the game, which is, I think that the randomness of the card draw and the randomness of what comes up that you said is all over the place doesn't work for me and is a little much in some instances, part of which, let me give you one example. So there are 4 cards, 1 in each of the 4 decks. The Gandalf, Saruman, the Witch King, the Lord of the Nazgul, and Aragorn. And in fact, in the case of Aragorn and Gandalf, there's actually 2 versions of them. But there's one main version of them which is essential, really helps to get early in the game. It gives you, if you put it in reserve, you get to draw an extra card. That's fantastic to get early in the game. Now, you also then have the option of committing that to the battle, and it's an interesting decision about whether you commit that powerful card to the battle or whether you keep drawing the extra card there. But clearly, if in my experience, somebody who gets those cards at the bottom of their deck are at a real disadvantage to somebody those cards are at the top of your deck. And
to some extent, yes. And most of those cards have a secondary card, such as Gandalf has Gwahir, which allows you to auto-summon Gandalf. And the Witch King has an auto-summon as well. So there is some mitigation there. I understand if you have both of those cards as your 29th and 30th card, yeah, you're kind of at a big disadvantage there, absolutely.
Well, here's another thing with the Witch King, though. There's a card which allows the Witch King to, if cycled. It is removed, it gets cycled. And that is an essential card. Mm-hmm. And if you get that card on it, because now you don't want to commit the Witch King and lose the Witch King permanently attacking early in the game. No way. But if you have that card, you can do it when necessary.
Well, and let's drill down into why those cards are so important. Let's just take Gandalf. Some cards are really good at like one thing, but many of them have this inherent tension in their use value, and these cards demonstrate that more than any other. Gandalf the Grey has a base value, attack value of 2, defense value 2, and path combat 3. Fully outfitted with items, he has +3 to all of those stats, and can force a card cycle on the shadow forces, and increases the player's carryover limit so that they can pass early. And then play him into a path, and you can use his action to force the next path card, probably auto-winning that path because he already has so much inherent path defense. But perhaps by so doing, you are eliminating Gandalf in the process if you're not careful. Similarly, play him into a battlefield and you're probably winning that battle. But again, perhaps losing Gandalf in the process forever. But play him into reserve, and there is just the implied threat that you will do all or any of these things. The Shadow Forces have to consider whether they can beat a +6 path defense as well as a +5 battlefield defense before they take any action whatsoever. Do I really want to commit to that? They could throw a Gandalf at me. And maybe that is the best, just the possibility of a Gandalf threat sitting there in front of you. And then playing Gwahir into reserve, you have the threat of Gandalf all over again, pulling him back from the deck. This forces this I dare you bluffing moments. Because as threatening as a fully loaded Gandalf or a +3 path defense Mithril Coat Sam is, after it's played, those cards can be eliminated forever out of the game. So I may throw 3 Black Riders and my partner a Balrog onto a path to generate +6 path corruption in order to create this Sophie's choice for the Free Peoples, where they must decide, I play my Gandalf card and defend that path and forever lose it to the Mines of Moria, or I let the Shadow Forces take 4 victory points. And then they sacrifice this looming threat, opening up later acts of the game for those Shadow Forces to forever play. I have had to make those choices myself during this game. Yeah, that Gandalf is just screwing me. I'm going to sacrifice this card so that they have to sacrifice their card, or I will get 5 points.
Yeah, there are definitely some interesting decisions there. At the same time, there are still some things in what you're talking about. I want to also pick out one of the things that you're talking about that really didn't sit well with my group, which is a core mechanism of the game. And I think it's worth talking about. A core mechanism of this game is that battlegrounds can be either added from the deck or refought from somebody's victory point pile through the use of certain cards. And my group hated this mechanism, and it basically is the main reason, not the main reason, but a key reason my group didn't like this game, Pat.
Explain.
And that mechanism, and in fact, some members of the thing, people hated the mechanism so much they wouldn't use it. They wouldn't play cards that recalled battlegrounds because they hated it. And I think a key aspect of why they disliked it, although no one quite voiced this, but my sense was that thematically, I don't think it made a lot of sense. I'm not saying mechanically it didn't make a lot of sense, but I won this battle, but now I can go back in time and refight this battle. This is what people at my table were saying. And I don't think
you're going back in time. I mean, if you think about Helm's Deep, the Rohirrim went to that location time and again, through eons and generations. As far as I see it, Isengard just decided to send 2 different forces to Helm's Deep and force Theoden to, sacrifice Éowyn, and in the next battle, sacrifice Éomer, and, eventually capitulate to defeat. I think that it just is a different version of what happened inside of the books.
Well, you can put it that way. And I don't, if it works thematically for people, I really don't have an idea. I just, mechanically and thematically, it was not a winning mechanism for my group. And I had mixed feelings about it. I thought it created interesting decisions as a card game, but it meant you really had to know the deck and which cards can do that and how to respond to that. In early games, I think people felt kind of ripped off, like they won something and then it was taken away from them. I had this move, I'm playing the Saruman player and the Dark Power player. I mean, the Fellowship had fought long and hard to win the Helm's Deep battle. And then in the next round, I pulled it out, resummoned it in a situation they couldn't defend it, and took it away from them.
Thus giving you the differential value of what they fought over as the points that they lost as well as the points that he gained.
And they were not happy.
I mean, that's a killer blow. It's immense. I'll tell you, in my second 4-person game, Aragorn was sitting there with Anduril for half the game, threatening to recall Minas Tirith. In fact, they won the first Minas Tirith battle, and we withdrew it and pulled it out, sent our Corsairs out, as well as Grog, Totem of the Underworld, I forget what it's called, but the big battering ram, and we're able to win Minas Tirith back. But forever after, Aragorn was sitting there with Anduril in hand, threatening to recall +3 defense Minas Tirith and force a 6-point differential in the game. And that was something that I constantly had to watch out for. I just held in my hand reserve cards, watching for that to come out, reserve cards that would allow me to pull out 2 Mordor armies and refight that battle if necessary. I understand that it can be frustrating, but yeah, if you know the deck and know that the threat is there, you will amply prepare for it.
So, to be clear, Pat, I have mixed feelings about it. I think it works mechanically. This is for me. It works mechanically. Thematically, I'm kind of like, I don't love it thematically, but I can live with it because I think it works mechanically. But I mention it because I think people's love or dislike of this game is going to depend a lot on how they feel about that mechanism. I think that's fair to say whether you like it or don't.
I think there's a larger question on communication and deck knowledge that I'd like to enter. One being communication, the side of it is it's imperative and it's thematic between players. The more that one communicates, the more that they can coordinate with their ally, which is especially necessary for the free peoples, where so much of the elf
more
deck,
for them.
Yeah, it's about passing back and forth items and these synergies that empower the other side or the other aspects of your own deck with the free people, the Dunedain/elf character. But at the same time, the more that they speak their mind of what they have in their hand, the more that they literally reveal their hand to the opposing players, and they can gauge how much of a powerful foe they are in that round. And this is especially thematic for the free peoples. They've got these synergies, and they may reveal their hand before they play it, much like Frodo regularly threatens to reveal the location of the ring to the Nazgul. It's incredibly thematic. Now,
that feels cool, and it definitely feels different between players. The Dark Power player, I feel like, has fewer synergies, so less reason to communicate. I'm sitting there playing Saruman in one game, and I'm like, you know what? I'm just not going to tell my teammate much because I think it helps the Free People players more to have that knowledge out on the table.
The question between them is more, hey, can you get me another card? Hey, can you fight into the battleground? Hey, can you fight into that path? And that will inform me whether I should play this valuable card or not.
In fact, you'll like this, Pat. In one point, my teammate asked me if I could help him at Minas Tirith, and I was like, nah, I can't do much there. And I lied to my teammate, basically.
Awesome. That's
because
hilarious.
That made the other players, the Free People players, think that I couldn't do much there.
Yeah.
When I was holding a powerful card in reserve that could do a lot there.
So did you pass and drain their effective card threat?
Yeah, I came in with that card at the very end.
Was it Grog?
No, this was, I was playing the Saruman player, so it was like the Mumakil, the elephants.
Mumakil, yeah, okay.
The giant elephants came in at
That's
Minas
great. And you
end.
came in after they expended all of their card value. That rips. That totally rips. Now, with that, that's awesome. I love that aspect of the communication. One downside to this game is an inherent upside. There's an inherent up value, but unless you have a dedicated group, you're going to run into this issue. Someone who knows the game better can quarterback for both players. We had a game where Wilson, I think he's played maybe 6 to 10 games of this. He knew the decks much better than his partner, Chris. Chris from Oregon. And by the midpoint of the game, he was effectively playing for both of them. No, don't play Aragorn yet. Play him into reserve and wait until you have the Anduril item and Dead Men of Dunharrow. If you do have Anduril, play it now so we can bring Minas Tirith out of their victory pile and have a 6-point differential. No. Don't play your elves in reserve yet. Put that back. Dol Amrith is only worth 1 point. It's just not worth it. You should wait until Rivendell comes out and play them then. And I think it's amazing that this game can offer these sorts of card combinations and intense decisions, but it is a shame when individuals are not able to discover them and come up with these synergies themselves. And I think it's an incredible advantage as well for one side to effectively have agency over 60 cards instead of the 30 in their hand. I do think that it is a tremendous advantage to not only have the foreknowledge of the deck, but also to have one player have foreknowledge of the deck and have substantial amounts of communication with the other player. Now, if we had 4 players that had all played this game regularly, I think that could be amazing. And there's an incredible upside there to knowing these decks and being able to predict the card combinations of the other side and come up with these synergistic ideas oneself and kind of communicate them. But that wasn't the case for us. I have played this game I think 5 times now, twice at the trilogy level, and having one person play about 10 times creates this big differential in experience and quarterbacking.
Yeah, I think one way you're saying it is this needs a very specific group to be played. This is some games you can just take the new person and you can take the person who's played 10 times and you can take the person who likes this and the person who likes that and just throw them all together and have a great time. No, this needs 4 players who want to play this game and are all of about the same experience level for the best experience, I think. And if you don't have that, it can suffer, as you said there. Like you said, it gets revealed as people know the game. So early on, you have to accept that bad things are going to happen to you because you don't know the deck and you don't know the other players' decks. Mm-hmm. It's a game that rewards a specific play group repeating it over and over again. I think listeners should know whether they can put that group together or not.
Yeah.
I have one more criticism that's not about the recycling the battlegrounds, which again, I have mixed feelings about. I do feel like, for me, I didn't like the restrictiveness of how often cards were not useful in how they had to be very, I understand the thematics of it, and I understand the wanting to decide whether to save it or play it now sort of thing, but so many cards I felt like, nope, doesn't work now. Nope, you can't play it now. Nope. I mean, I had so many cards in the game which just never got played, which I couldn't play. I mean, my last couple rounds, I was sitting in my last game, I was sitting with hands full of dead cards because I had all these cards, for instance, that were monster army cards, right? Had put some in reserve and was saving some in my hand because I knew Moria was still out there as a battleground, right? Mm-hmm. And I was going to win it because I had all these things. Well, Moria was the one battleground that didn't get played in that game.
Right.
So I had spent 12 cards, to win something that just never showed up. And that can happen. You know what I mean? You can have cards which just you save. You're like, aha, I'm going to use these when this comes up at this key moment, and then it never comes up.
I do think there's less flexibility in the shadow players with where they can play. Oftentimes things are distinctly Isengard or they're distinctly Mordor, and they only cross over a few times at Minas Tirith.
Well, and sometimes they're monsters.
Right. Right. I think it's more specific for them. And this didn't rear its ugly head too much, but it absolutely can. I mean, the final summation of the game, the final round, this reared its ugly head, where the paths and battlefields that we fought, they uniquely advantaged one side with their effects, sure,
yep,
but also with their our respective abilities to play on those areas. With our last game, the last round, the Shadow folks had 19 points and the Free Peoples had 20 points. It was incredibly close. And the final round was a battlefield that Mordor could not play into, and a path where both sides exhausted all of their usable cards. So in what felt like a stalemate, the Free Peoples were able to simply pass and pass until the Shadow Forces had no more cards. Now, Big John Gortat, who we played with, he had about 10 cards in hand, leading you to think he should have enough to play into this battle and effectively win it. But he simply did not have the applicable cards inside of his deck. Meanwhile, I was sitting there waiting for this threat and preparation that I made for a battle on Minas Tirith, but no grand victory occurred, just a whimpered cheer when the Free Peoples just passed and passed into victory. Now, objectively, I know that this final round was a sum of the entire game, right? That the Shadow Forces, they should have used their cards to gain one more corruption point on the previous round, and that the Mordor deck that I was utilizing, it was effectively empty of path-specific cards. I'd used up all of my Nazgul cards that could have applied to this path on other attempts at victory. And its potential for victory in this moment, my deck was effectively exhausted. Now, if the Shadow had mustered even, the Free Peoples probably would have forced Minas Tirith, and the Shadow would have only been defending 3 points and may have still lost anyways, but that could have been a grand moment. Instead, subjectively, it felt very disappointing for the game to end on such a whimper that, yes, subjectively felt like randomness dictated it, even though objectively I think it was our own fault for overplaying our hands and exhausting our deck in other moments.
Yeah, and those things, the restrictiveness of the card play can show up in the last round in anticlimactic fashion like you're talking about, but it can also show up in, I think, just round to round. I'd have to so many times when it was like, well, I just don't have any cards that apply to anything that's appearing, so I'm just going to put everything in reserve this round.
Well,
And
at
that's
least
not
there
bad,
you've got
but
the
it just
mitigation
means I'm not
technique of
making
the
any interesting
reserve.
What's that?
At least in that moment, you've got the mitigation technique of the reserve.
No, you can't. You do have the mitigation of reserve,
effectively
and I
store
like
it as
the
a
reserve
battery
mechanism.
for future rounds.
But I feel like there was too many rounds when I wasn't making interesting decisions because I didn't have cards that applied to that round.
Sure.
And that wasn't exciting to, and then of course when the thing that those cards in reserve applied to, there wasn't a really interesting decision to be made. It was like, I'm committing this stuff because I don't know if another battleground, stuff is going to appear again. It's getting in there, right?
Right, but at the same time, you are patting yourself on the back for having put those into reserve instead of wasted them
Right.
some
It just
other
didn't
way.
feel like a very interesting decision.
But
So
that brings up an interesting point, because a number of cards in a hand it's this kind of brilliant bluffing facade, right? Because you might have 10 cards in your hand, but none of them might be applicable to the current battle or path, right? There is this rule of having to cycle a card to play a card. You really you have half the playable cards that there appears. So you have this constant value judgment of what's playable given the situation and what is not, as well as what should be played into reserve to be played later. You're on a path 4 out of 9, and you have 2 cards that are extremely powerful for path 5. You may play them into reserve rather than cycle them as currency so that you can win that next path battle. But cards in your hand, it's also this threat of how much you can do against your opponents to affect the game state. You're doing this constant fuzzy math of possibility for yourself and your opponents to estimate just how much they can do to undergird or undo the work that's being done on the game. So as much as that is perhaps an issue, it's also kind of like poker. You can bluff as if there's something there and threaten, even if you've effectively got nothing in your hand.
It might be interesting to wrap up with whether we feel like this game feels thematic. And I feel like this is... What's that?
Oh my God, yes.
And to me, it doesn't. So I think this is where we're most going to disagree.
Oh, come on. The card abilities can feel awfully thematic.
Occasionally, and often, to me, sometimes they're just like, this is a strong card, it's +2, as opposed to the weaker card that's +1. There's a lot of that. I really don't think this game feels thematic at all, and I think one of the big ways it doesn't feel thematic is the way it works in victory points over rounds, which can lead to, it can lead to close games. It can also lead to games where you know the outcome most of the way through, but more than that, it doesn't feel like you won in any Lord of the Rings style way. The ring is not a part of this game. This is a victory point accumulation game, which is fine game mechanism, and it's used by most games, but I don't feel like that does not feel like the Lord of the Rings to me. The Lord of the Rings feels like, you destroyed the ring or you didn't, and maybe that's a harsh restriction to put on a card game. No, it doesn't. Now, certain card aspects do, but again, I'll come back to those battlegrounds being recalled really doesn't feel thematic for me.
I completely disagree. I think that the Lord of the Rings is about grand strategy of armies and peoples tied to the heroism and abilities of individuals who have something more than what is expected. And the card abilities, they can feel awfully thematic. Merry and Pippin, you can play them into pass bravely, but at any time they can be moved and be summoned into the Rohirrim or Dunedain battlefield, respectively, to fight bravely in those fields. This idea of this constant tension of, the eyes of Mordor are down upon the path. Now, the Free Peoples, Aragorn's going to strike out against the gates of Mordor right now and distract the Sauron eye, and Sauron's going to have to muster all of his forces and waste all of his ability to defend the Black Gate, and while the hobbits are able to just barely make it through inside of that path to victory. And that's extremely thematic. That's exactly what happens in the books, that distraction right there. Every single round is a distraction, this tension between the pass and the battlefields. It's extremely thematic.
There is a tension between those two things, and I like that that's put in. But let's talk about that one. Those ideal scenarios don't play out for me as... I would grant you it's occasionally thematic. They don't play out as often as I would think. For instance, I don't think it behooves the Fellowship player to attack hardly at all on the battlegrounds. They don't really need to. What they're trying to do, because they're the defender 3/4 of the time, and the defender has an advantage, it really makes sense for them to try to win those 3/4 of the contests rather than go. So there was almost no instances in the games that I played where the Fellowship was attacking on the battlegrounds that the Shadow player was defending. it's like the shadow player has more resources in the game, so why compete in an area where you're at a resource disadvantage? That's just...
But I guess you're just talking about a differential. If you read the books, the majority of the battles are, attacks on Helm's Deep, on Minas Tirith, the Corsairs of Umbar, raiding Dol
That's true, but what it means in this game is that a quarter of the contests, not much is happening there. And especially you've built up a bunch of, dark power player cards for that, and it's like they all apply to that battle. I'm like, I'm not even going to bother that the Free People's player isn't even attacking there. And you kind of constructed a scenario where they were. And my point is, those scenarios only occasionally happen. Sometimes it just feels anticlimactic.
That wasn't too much my experience, just because the Mordor and Isengard players have just so much attack and battlefield ability that it balances out. And I saw that there was, constant attacking, even if it's 3/4, there was constant attacking and vying. And it was a constant conversation on value for the Free Peoples. Is that worth it to us or not? Should we focus on the path and defending that, or should we try and get this point right now? What's worth more to us? It wasn't a simple open and shut book of, we're not going to fight on that battlefield. No, it's not worth it. Is more often what's worth more to us. I think it's much more interesting than what you're saying. On top of that, the decks, they have this incredible thematic empowerments that feel very characteristic of their types. They're Ohiram. They're on horses. They're rushing to supply one another and supply these battles. And they have the special ability of chaining the cycling of cards, where Theoden and Eomer and a Rohirrim battleground all let you draw 5 cards and play 1 Rohirrim card. This allowed the Rohirrim character during one of my games to draw 15 cards, autoplay 3 of them, and cycle through half of their deck, granting them the ability to get more cards back that they'd already played. The Mordor cards, they have these incredible lingering threats in the Nazgul cards. They're so spooky, where they hold cards in their reserve as a power-up, and this latent threat threatening to cycle their cards that add damage to a story path, add a defense to a battleground, redraw another card, draw additional cards, and they're cycled afterwards, only to threaten to be played again, and threatening the Fellowship once more. The Elf deck, over half of the cards synergize and empower cards in the Free People's decks. The Dunedain, they're really strong and versatile fighters, able to summon specific battlegrounds and be empowered to fight on and likely win those particular battlegrounds. The Wizard deck, this mishmash of incredibly idiosyncratic abilities that are quite powerful if the situation arises, such as the Ents, who are empowered while fighting on Orthanc or against Isengard foes, or the Hobbits that I mentioned. They can dominate paths and are often cycled only to be used again. Okay, fine. Dwarf deck, mostly useless, it's just Gimli. But Isengard, it's like a Magic Commander deck. Where Saruman, he's the focus of that universe. Who can be powered up multiple times and
I get your passion, but I
as an
think
extreme menace.
you're
Monsters, they're all like Balrog. They're forsaking the Free People's cards. Balrog style, where no foe that defeats a Balrog can ever survive. The monster deck has 7 potential forsake actions that can result in a cumulative loss of 14 cards for the Free Peoples. They're so thematic and well done.
But here's the thing. I never feel like it's a big deal to have cards forsaken on the Free People's side because they have an excess of cards.
No, they don't. They have 60.
No, but I feel like they don't lose nearly as many during the course of the game and are never in danger of running out of cards.
Maybe your 4-player game, they weren't getting attacked enough.
To have cards that bring another card out, as you're talking about the Rohirrim doing, does not make this suddenly magically thematic in my mind. To have cards that apply to a specific path because that's the path in the book they appeared doesn't make it magically thematic. It makes it more frustrating to me that often that path doesn't appear and you can't use that card in its designated way in most games. So
I had a constant
I get your
well
passion,
of
and I get that
headcanon.
it can feel thematic in those moments. And for our group, and by the way, to be clear, I have a mixed feeling about this game, but I liked it far better than anyone else did at the table. And I almost wish we had Mitch on here because Mitch passionately disliked this game.
I had a constant run of headcanon in this game that all felt thematic, from the communication to the cards themselves to the design of the game of mandala style. I'm playing over here to waste and exhaust abilities so that I can actually play over here, this grand strategy that's inside of it. It is awfully thematic.
And I think this almost is a segue to our conversation about the juncture of theme and mechanisms, because I think it'll feel more thematic to you. One, if you like the theme, but also if those mechanisms are working for you in the game. And for some of our players, the mechanisms were not working for them in the game, so they didn't then jump to the theme, right? If the mechanisms, they liked the game mechanisms, I think it would have pulled harder for them to look at how that fit thematically.
Well, I think it begs the question. I'm obviously a Lord of the Rings fan. I'm looking at my bookshelf and I see the Book of Lost Tales Part 2 sitting up there. I've read and reread all of the Lord of the Rings multiple times. Obviously, the designers of this game are Lord of the Rings fans because they pulled from the book trilogy rather than the movie trilogy. The fact that they included Prince Imrahil, the Knights of Dol Amroth, the Corsairs of Umbar, who can re-raid certain battlegrounds, it lets me know that they are fans of the books, which allowed them to pull from a much deeper and richer universe than the movies. And some of the things in it, yes, they felt overpowered, but they felt thematically integrated in a way that they followed the logic of that original story and that universe that was created there in a way that mechanically it replicated it. So I was able to accept even any sense of this doesn't feel fair. Well, no, it did feel fair because it was playing into the rules of the universe.
I got you. I just want to be clear that the 3 people I played with who didn't like the game are all big Lords of the Ring fans and all big card game players. So it wasn't like anyone was, you know what I mean, the wrong sort of person for this game. And I personally, again, I enjoyed myself with the mechanisms. I'm more skeptical about the theme. And I would, if there was a dedicated group of this game, I would be happy to play this game with them a lot. But I don't think I would work to put that group together is kind of where I land on this game.
Oh, I would. I am thinking about this game constantly. I'm re-reviewing the decks of cards. I'm thinking about their abilities. I cannot wait to play this game again, and ideally with Wilson and John Gortat and maybe Matthew from the Pilsen crew, because I think if they could get really into it and play it with me 5 or 10 times. I frankly, Tony, I love this game.
Well, I would be happy to play with you guys to do this game. And I don't want to, it's not a game that I'm going to enjoy with people who aren't in the same place that you and Wilson and John are.
Fair enough. Although I will say you could probably play the Fellowship scenario with folks who aren't as much into it. I would say always play Trilogy if you can. Fellowship is more of a trifle. You miss a lot. You won't be cycling through your decks. You miss out on synergies between players, and the free peoples have a much harder upward battle. But it is great if you only have so much time to play, in that it has the basic mechanisms. It turns the game into much more of a beer and pretzel sort of game, removes a lot of that replayability, and is much more a value judgment of, do I play into the path or do I play into the story? Much less about, am I cycling through my deck? Is this worth doing now? Because you only have so much time in the game. You're probably going to play everything as soon as you have it.
Here's a counterpoint that you may not like. I had more fun playing the 2-player game.
Yeah.
Significantly more fun. And part of it was that, again, my players at 4 players didn't enjoy the game, and it's hard to enjoy yourself when other people aren't enjoying the game. Like lots of other people, all other 3 other people are not enjoying the game.
I've never known you to be one who's affected by other people's opinions, Tony. Surprised to hear that.
No, I think you get what I'm saying. If you're playing a Euro game with 4 people and the other 3 people are visibly and vocally not having fun, it's hard to enjoy.
Yeah, no, I know what you're saying. I saw Across the Spider-Verse with my mom and my wife, who hadn't seen Into the Spider-Verse, and they were just watching that movie with all of its like 100 different art styles and jumping through parallel universes, just wondering what the is going on. And I was just sitting there cringing like, oh God, why did we pick this movie? I am enjoying myself, but if they're not enjoying themselves, I want to walk out.
Yeah, so some of it was that. Some of it was that in the 2-player version, the card draw randomness is less. Like, it's more control of what cards come up. What you need is going to come up. There's less times of like, oh, that's not going to apply. And the battlegrounds are the same, and so you know what's going to come up. It's all going to apply, so that you're less irritated by the randomness, or at least I was.
I would disagree. I mean, the story, the path combat, and the battlegrounds are consistent in how they come out, and you can forecast them. But your deck is still 30 cards, and you're cycling through it much less, and you're only going to play through it once. And so the basic first half of your deck versus your second half of your deck, it's not all going to be applicable. It's not all going to be played out in an optimal way each time. I think the fact...
But when a card shows up, you know it's going to be, when it's going to be used, and that it's going to be used, so you can make those decisions.
Yeah, but the fact that
decisions accurately.
The fact that he can't hold on to those cards, for their optimal moment, because you need a good card right now because it's that close, means that just the deck itself can really screw you. I mean, I'll tell you, I started one game of the fellowship aspect, the fellowship scenario, with 7 items, and I wasn't able to play any of them. So I just got crushed from the very start. I mean, I ended up getting a tie, but Shadow Player wins and ties, and I was the Fellowship, and that was just a struggle all the way down. There was nothing that I could do because, again, you don't cycle your deck in that game. You're just left with what you have.
Fair enough, but I liked the predictability of the paths in Battle. This may seem sacrilege to you and how you like this game. I would have liked it if the main 4-player game, you knew which paths and battlegrounds were going to show up in that game. Now, I like the variety of mixing them up, but I like if you could have seen what they were at the start of the game.
I like the variety. And
oh, no, I like the variety. You choose one and do 3, but once you choose one of the 3, I would have liked to have known what those were at the start of the game, or at least the round before or something.
Well,
but that's me.
There are certain cards that allow you to see the future, at least of your own deck.
Oh, final thing on the review, Pat. I like the card art. I think the card art is really nice.
Oh, it's super good. It's brilliant. Yep. It's very thematically wonderful. I mean, if you look at Prince Imrahil, you see the royalty of him on his horse with his, silver cap on. You see the wonderment of how he's almost as kingly as Aragorn. I think that, or the threat of the Balrog, or just Saruman's massive blank face, and his cloak of many colors, how that kind of shimmers on the card art. It's wonderful. It's threatening when it needs to be threatening. It's royal when it needs to be royal. They did a wonderful job with the artists.
Agreed. So that's the War of the Ring card game, and it brings up some interesting issues about the intersection of theme and mechanisms, which we'd like to explore a bit.
So, as I mentioned, clearly the designers of War of the Ring, the card game, are fans of the Lord of the Rings book trilogy. And
that I will grant you.
Yes. Now the question is, are the designers fans of the IP? But also, are the players fans of the IP? If not, how much BS are they willing to put up with, the kind of chrome that comes with IP, right? Red Rising, a game that we reviewed maybe 2 years ago now, game about basically Aldous Huxley's caste system, but on Mars. It did absolutely nothing for me because I hadn't read the books. I just found myself wanting to read Aldous Huxley and the division between the gold people versus the working class red people. I didn't find anything from that, and the gameplay itself, the main mechanisms of them, I just thought were, a faulty version of Fantasy Realms. But if I had read the books, perhaps I would have thrived in their made-up world and said, oh, this gold character's out, and, he interacts with this pink character, and they're in love, and so it's fine, and, they have this special ability that ties between them, and so, I love that. And maybe I would have enjoyed that game a lot more, and it would have gotten me over the hump of the mechanisms, which I thought were fairly poor. But at the same time, the flip side of that is if I am a fan, then a thematic integration, it can allow me to see incredible power balances as a fun thematic challenge. As folks might know, I am a Dune fan. And in Dune, the board game, the Bene Gesserit faction, they're incredibly idiosyncratic in their victory conditions. You can only win if you correctly guess a faction as well as the time that a fellow faction will win the game. It's incredibly difficult to win with, but it's so thematic in that the Bene Gesserit, who are this group of witch women, space witches, who effectively invoke power and burden up power amongst other factions, and have this grand design that's over the course of 30,000 years to control genetic inheritance and power balances throughout the galaxy, that they must climb onto and influence another house to force it a victory at a time and place that they name a victory of their design. I love that. It's so Dune, but so any power imbalance, it's forgiven because the rules in the game are so consistent with the rules that are implied by that larger universe.
Yeah, and you're talking about a very specific American-style game, right? But if a game gives you the feel of a universe, it doesn't have to duplicate all those specifics. I mean, it's great that Dune does, but a game like Wonderland's War does not duplicate all the specific narrative beats of Alice in Wonderland, right? But it feels so thematic because, one, the quirky randomness and the sudden violence and the sudden surprises, that feel of the game is just a match for the feel of the universe. And so push your luck bag building just feels right for the Wonderland, right? So matched with a great production and art style, the game feels like Alice in Wonderland without any of the narrative beats or specifics like you're talking about with the Bene Gesserit showing up in the game. And a game can do that. And often that's important in Euro-style games, which don't get the freedom that American-style games do to, specifically tailor their rules on the exact story beats and exact mechanisms, like that Dune example you gave, right? I think it's even more impressive when a Euro game can give you that full feeling of theme and it's still very abstract in its mechanisms.
I
right?
think it's, in a sense, incredibly lucky that Wonderland's War is as good of a game as it is, because the thematic ties are effectively a tea party where you go around a circle, and the kind of goofiness and craziness of the bag building and the draw. I think you could recast that game. I'm not saying that it would be as good of a retheming, but you could recast that game in a way that it would be much more difficult to recast Dune. Yes, I know that Dune was recast and rethemed as another game, but did anyone buy it? I don't think so. But take that, and there's a risk inherent there of applying an IP as a gloss rather than full thematic integration, in that a fan may bounce hard off of that game. Dune Imperium. One of the reasons that I did not like it is that it only felt Dune-ish and did not fully encapsulate the Dune universe. The wars felt objective and constant, not something that happens in Dune, and the faction abilities felt uninspiring. I want more Dune in my Dune game, and this thin veneer of theme left on Dune Imperium left me feeling cynical and doubting its legitimacy. Maybe it's a cash grab. Why use this theme? Should the Bene Gesserit really be this powerful in this sense? Are they really going to have 10 different battles all on Dune? I don't think so. This doesn't make sense. Right.
I see. I disagree. Now, I don't think it's the most thematic game in the world, but I think the feeling of these value versus value battles, and where you've got all these little hidden card weapons up your sleeve in reserve, is very, very Dune-like feeling. And in fact, some of the Dune feelings remind me of some of the War of the Ring card game, in that the War of the Ring card game feels Lord of the Rings-ish to me in the same way that Dune does. I'm not saying it's the most thematic game in the world, but I'm a little surprised that you see one is really thematic and the other is not.
Well,
but that's me.
I think that there's an incredible headcanon, as I said, in War of the Ring that just isn't there inside of Dune. I think that it falls into the realm of the Frankenstein and Sherlock and Cthulhu public IP, where it's, well, we're going to use this because we can at this point. It's familiar to people, and it's going to be recognizable to people. More people will buy this game because of this IP. That's where the Dune Imperium game falls for me. Come at me, bro. I don't like the game. DM me. I don't care.
I'm not gonna rehash that battle with you.
Going back to IP, specifically IP-based games a bit, thematic fidelity, it can lead to some disturbing situations for players, especially those who don't have the thematic backing of the game. In a Game of Thrones, the board game, the Lannisters have an incredible amount of idiosyncratic chrome to their faction, in that they can potentially be eliminated within the first 3 rounds because they have so few lands.
And everyone hates the Lannisters.
But suffice to say, the game is thematic in that the Lannister family buys and earns influence through deceit, but mechanically it can be devastatingly idiosyncratic to the uninitiated player, either uninitiated to the gameplay or uninitiated to the theme, in that they could be knocked out within the first 3 rounds. A fan can probably roll with this and call it thematic integration and kind of laugh off the fact that they got knocked out of the game that early. But a non-fan may wonder why they came to Boone's house to play this game for 5 hours and now they're just sitting here twiddling their thumbs. That's a risk with that level of chrome and integration.
Maybe I'm too much of a modern board gamer, but I think if thematic integration means that you've got to have early player elimination in a long game, that at least for me, you've gone off the rails with your thematic integration. Now, I understand Game of Thrones. If you're going to do Game of Thrones, you're going to be uncompromising. It's going to be that kind of game. I'm not saying if you don't enjoy it, that's great. But for me, you've kind of now I'm having memories of playing Risk as a kid and having to sit in the other room doing nothing while everyone else plays for 6 more hours.
Right. I mean, the other side of this is for the mechanisms to be so generic as to, be matching the theme in such a, casual sense as to, be accessible to anyone. I'm thinking like Marvel United, the team-based game where, yes, okay, the theming is that the heroes can help each other, and you'll be able to use the card that Captain America played, and you're Black Widow, and you're playing off of each other. And the thematic integration comes from you're saving people while fighting the bad guy, while working together. And the only real difference between the characters is the different minis that they allow for.
Well, that's not entirely true. There are some different mechanical aspects, and the villains that you fight, particularly in Marvel United, do have different interesting powers. But I'll completely agree they don't capture the heroes at all. But I'm not sure you could in a short game. And I think this is why I'm a Euro gamer and not an American-style gamer, ultimately at heart, if I had to choose one or the other. Because Marvel United works for me as a game, and it's a game that, to me, works. The theme is thin, and the mechanisms are great. Right? Well, whereas an American-style game with clunky mechanisms and a great theme is something I'll play once.
Well, and from a sense, it's fairly thematic to a Marvel model in that it says, hey, we're going to use a kind of basic formula and put something that's familiar to people that already has an established fan club in it, and that's going to be the product that we generate, right? It's a good formula. It's not a bad one. I liked Marvel United well enough. I like most Marvel movies, but I do think of it as an often used formula that doesn't necessarily get any deeper than the surface level that it presents.
That perhaps more interesting than looking at these IPs is how games without an IP and without even a super compelling theme still manage or fail to be thematic with a little twist here, right? I'll give you my favorite example. Which I've mentioned a number of times on this podcast, which is Dogs of War. Now, Dogs of War, we're playing medieval mercenary captains. It's not the most super compelling theme. It's not some universe that we all know or anything like that. But the idea, in a single sentence, is that we're all these amoral captains. We want to win battles, but we also just want to get loot, right? And the mechanisms totally support this because you're going tug-of-war style in these battles, but you're also taking worker placement actions, which create the tension of the game because the worker placement actions may give you loot that are not the best places to go to win the battles you want to go. So you're in this tension between, am I trying to win battles or grab loot on the battlefield? That's the mechanical tension of the game, and it's also a perfect thematic match for what the game is trying to do. And the fact that you can switch sides in the battle, also a perfect mechanism and thematic match for being this amoral mercenary captain. The mechanisms are not complicated. You line up in a tug-of-war battle, or you take worker placement actions to grab stuff, but it's just, you feel like this amoral, for lack of a better word, dick in this game in such a perfect matching way that most games so fail to accomplish.
Yeah, sure. I mean, Barrage has something similar where you are an implied capitalist jerk trying to fight the other companies for control over the water pathways, and it implies this larger, desperate world. Or Scythe, which started out as simply a game about 1918 Max marching around peasant lands after a world war, and then they found that this complex of art and story was so potentially enriching that they built out an entire legacy campaign around it. Yeah, there's a lot of Euros that impressively develop out their own IP from the mechanisms and artwork itself. That can, live on outside of it and greater than it. Mm.
I think for me, this is why I like this guy's games probably more than most people, is because they always feel good to me both mechanically and thematically, which are Ryan Laukat's whole series of games, particularly his Arzium series of games. You can't look at the art and whether it's a storybook or just some small story elements in the game and not feel happy in the theme, and at the same time, I think he's a very underrated Eurogame designer. And I don't think all of his games always mesh perfectly, and some of them, you have this story veneer over what can be a pretty dry Eurogame, and I don't even mean that badly. But I like that he's always trying hard on both levels.
Well, that's a guy who needs a ghostwriter to buff out his actual presence in the larger IP. He's got a lot of IP that he's established that is waiting for somebody to design some.
I think they're doing a Kickstarter
storytelling around it.
They're doing a Kickstarter for an Arzium role-playing game right now, soon.
Makes total sense. I think somebody should probably write some young adult fiction around it too. I think it would be perfect for that.
Yeah. We've been all over the place, kind of looking at different IPs and dry Euro games here in terms of theme versus mechanisms. Any other games you want to single out as failing or really succeeding in this regard?
I'll say Tainted Grail. They've now created an RPG that's effectively an Elder Scrolls type game with full buffed out storylines that are independent of the original board game. It's, it is great to see board game IPs that started off as cardboard that are growing out into paper and ones and zeros. I think that's impressive that this hobby can support something such as that to grow out into a larger presence out in the world.
Nice.
Well, that's going to do it for Two Wood for a Wheat. You can check us out on our Discord in the show notes. Email us at twowoodforawheat@gmail.com. Check out Tony's blog. He's at Max Longstreet, The Secrets of Great Games. And if you've got any questions for us, hit us up at one of those places. As far as games that are coming up, I know this weekend, Tony is heading to Gen Con along with Big John. So I think
we'll be reporting back with Jonathan Gortat about the craziness at Gen Con.
Yeah, I think we'll have a big Gen Con extravaganza. And as far as after that, we will see. But I'm excited to hear about your return to the con. Thanks, folks, and stay frosty. Two Wood for a Wheat is recorded across the airwaves in Bear Creek, Pennsylvania, and Chicago, Illinois. We're produced by Tony Faber and edited by Patrick Flannery. Follow us on Instagram at TWFAW and find more episodes and blog posts at twowoodforawheat.com.